I was born in England, in Kent, in 1962, and during the almost entirety of my educated lifetime, liberal ideas of one sort or another, libertarian, centre-left, far-left ideas, have been hegemonic and dominant amongst most educated people in Britain and elsewhere. It may come as sort of news to people, particularly in the United States, that there is really very little freedom of expression in Britain and in parts of Western Europe about certain key matters. It's rather ironic because probably the rest of the world thinks that, opinion was free here and the Second World War was fought for freedom of expression and so on, whereas there's no First Amendment right here, and there are many ways in which discussion is curtailed. Most educated and artistic people in England and Britain now are vaguely liberal-minded, or at the very least they go along with what's called a politically correct mindset. Now, this has grown up over the last 40 to 50 years since the sort of cultural revolution of the 1960s. And you have a sort of situation now where almost everybody who goes through tertiary and even higher secondary education comes out with a slightly identikit formulation, the same sort of views about certain core issues, or the same belief that certain topics are unsayable or are off limits, particularly about generic inequality, biological differences between people, or inherent differences between male and female. I was about 18, coming on 20, when Margaret Thatcher came to power in Britain, and it's paradoxical that the liberal left was not so entrenched in establishmentarian discourse then as now, the better part of 30 years on. However, the far left, by which we mean a sort of Trotskyite, sort of ultra-left, they had enormous power, at least at the level of the street, by which I mean in campuses. They had the power to break the windows of dons who had ideas that they disapproved of, particularly in the biological sciences, but also in psychology and culture and elsewhere. And the interesting thing about the Conservative Party is that, one, it ceased to be culturally conservative in a metaphysical sense a long time ago, and two, it's never understood the cultural struggle that the radical left has waged inside European societies, which includes Britain and indeed the United States. Conservatism has never conserved anything for about 40 to 50 years, and because it allowed the arts and the media and much of the clerisy and intelligentsia to be completely penetrated by the ideas of their sworn enemies, you've ended up in Britain and elsewhere with this strange hybrid of a left-wing capitalist society. I think many people internalise the idea that right-wing values, elitist values, values of prior identity, values of belief in hierarchies and so on, were somehow wrong or vaguely immoral or non-permissible, or in a much more mercenary way wouldn't sort of foster one's career too much in the future. So the moral uncertainty of certain people, even on the moderate right, meant that they had partly internally collapsed in relation to a range of ideas. I also think it's important to understand that the left understood that it had lost the battle over the economy several generations back, and since Gramsci in the latter part of the second decade of the 20th century had been fighting various forms of cultural war, primarily against conservative opponents who were increasingly mentally defenceless against them. It's as if you've had a shuffling to the left in all areas, in religion, in the media, in the academy, in the arts, even in the sort of semi-sciences, the humanistic sciences and the social sciences, and even in the softer parts of the hard sciences. So you've had a shift to the left in all areas. The one thing I always thought about conservatism, even very right-wing conservatism, is there's a great cultural aridness there. British culture, particularly English culture, is strongly pragmatic, sort of non-heuristic, anti-conceptual, pragmatic and utilitarian. Margaret Thatcher was a scientist, and it showed in the politics, and particularly the cultural politics of her government, when you bear in mind that she had as much power as Reagan had in the United States, particularly in the first term, and yet virtually nothing was done with this cultural power. And it's also the absence of a complete sort of what you might call civilizational discourse that many conservative politicians had, that led me to look at political tendencies further out, if you like. Politics is limited in a way in this era. I think this is quite true when you look at the vote that radical right parties get. They come up, they go down. I suppose the party in Belgium, the Vlaams Blok, and Jean-Marie Le Pen's organisation in the French Fifth Republic, the Front National, have done the best on the western side of the continent, but even they are partly peripheral, demonised, out of power, and very far away from even having a hand upon the hand that controls the tiller of their respective states. So I think one of the many reasons for this is that the entire culture, the entire zeitgeist is against you. And therefore, I think that you have to sit, as Gramsci and other leftists did 90 to 100 years ago, and work out what can be done to push the culture back in a more organic, more traditional, more elitist, more hierarchical way. And therefore, I think that cultural struggle, particularly in the arts, because I see the arts as the dream space or the subconscious of the society, I think it's extraordinarily interesting and or important, and it's really my fundamental interest to see what can be done in that area and whether you can engage in what they call détournement, this idea that you can turn around the specificity of the moment and you can invert the cultural inversion of the last 40 to 50 years. Because I take an elitist view of culture. I believe that everything comes down from above, and I believe that the brain is the mind and the mind dominates the body, but the mind is also a part of the body. I think the contemporary West suffers from an extraordinary mind-body split, and the intelligentsia has gone off and talks to themselves and doesn't connect to the bulk of people in Western societies at all. I personally think if you put into the recurrency ideas and cultural forms which have a primal element, have in some respects a pagan dimension, I think you can knit the mind and the body back together again. I think you move people at a level beneath the mind, physiologically, in terms of the emotions. In fact, the right is most powerful when it appeals to the subconscious as much as the conscious mind. And I think an enormous number of people, including the right's bitterest and harshest opponents, are slightly subconsciously attracted to it in spite of themselves. That's why they can never stop talking about it. And I do believe in cultural inversion, that you can get into the subconsciousness of the era that you're in and begin to turn it around. Religion, to me, deals with emotional rather than normative or factual or empirical truth. Emotional truth is far more powerful and is ultimately what draws the energy of civilizations together, what creates great ecstasies, what creates great waves of creation and destruction, what creates great civilizations and prepares for their fall. I personally think that the heightened creative energy that comes from emotionally based rationality reaches the spiritual. But for me, artistic activity is probably the nearest that I get to religious belief. I see politics and art in a slightly occultistic way. In the occult, if you like, you have a destructive potentiality, which is the left, and you have a concrete and stabilizing force, which is the right. And yet, the energy comes from the left onto the right to energize it and to reformulate the nature of civilization and its discourse. And therefore, I see partly the ultra-right as having certain energies which are drawn from the left and are purified by the right and then move further out because there isn't room elsewhere on the spectrum for them. The reason that the far right is vilified and demonized all over the Western world is because it represents the fundamentalist energies of its own culture. An enormous number of Western artists and writers and intellectuals were attracted to fascism in the first 30 to 40 years of the 20th century, and they were often attracted in an emotional way at a level deeper than reason because they were attracted to the foundational and fundamentalist beliefs of their own civilization. Often with culture, you have to make things concrete. For example, cinema is the mass art of modernity that appeals to the intellectual and appeals to the man who's got almost no mind at all, because the images go straight onto his nervous system. It's an organic form of art that can appeal to the professor at one end and the road sweeper at the other. And cinema is the mass medium of modernity. It's why communism and fascism were obsessed with cinema and obsessed with control of it. Modernism is partly a diabolical form of art, and I'm not an aesthetic conservative. I'm in part a revolutionary and a conservative. See, I think the imagination is incredibly powerful, and I think imagination moves people more than reason. I think the reason people are attracted to the radical right, even though the forefront of their mind says they're not, is the power that it has. And that power is negative as well as positive. It's not just beauty, it's beauty and ugliness combined, synthesized, and even stepped beyond. So I suppose my aesthetics are Nietzschean in a way, and I'm a sort of right-wing modern person in some ways. I would like the world to be different from what it is, obviously, but this is where I differ from Evola. Evola said there was three alternatives to modernity: suicide, being a Nietzschean, or getting rid of it all and destroying it and returning to absolute tradition based upon prior metaphysical realities. I think we're in the modern world, and what you have to do is turn its energies in an elitist way